And joining us now in the nation's capital, Judy Rebick, author of Occupy This and the founder of the website rabble.ca. Judy, good to have you back on TVO. How are you?
Nice to be here. I'm good. Yeah.
Good. I want to start with this. In the midst of the financial crisis, of course, as you know, governments and others have increasingly turned to, I guess, so-called bureaucrats and technocrats to guide policymaking. And I want to just start by getting your take on what you think of this new trend.
Well, I'm not sure it's exactly a new trend in the sense that they've always relied on bureaucrats who were talking about staff members inside of government, by using the word bureaucrat. But what's new is this paying fortunes of money to people like Donald Drummond or people like Deloitte Touche in Ottawa to give them advice from outside government on what they should be doing. And I think it's a very troubling trend for democracy.
For what it's worth, they probably paid Don Drummond about a tenth of what he used to get on Bay Street. So by that yardstick, you could say they were getting a pretty good advice for a pretty cheap penny. Sorry, we don't have pennies anymore, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, it depends. I wonder how long that joke's going to last.
Yeah.
You know, probably about a few months anyway. Yeah, you know, it depends on your point of view. Like, I think one of the reasons that it's happening is that we've so privatized our thinking about things that we start thinking so much of the economy is about what's good for Bay Street that we start thinking that someone who's totally in the framework of Bay Street is the right person to give us policy advice. But the fact of the matter is, you know, the people who are on Bay Street or people who are running corporations don't have an idea about what's good for the economy in the sense of how it's going to impact ordinary people. And we see that in the budgets that we see coming down.
I take your point, but when you look overseas, you know, we see in Italy and in Greece, they actually made technocrats, they appointed technocrats to be their new prime ministers. I mean, we're nothing close to having anything like that happen here, right?
Not yet, we're not, but we're also not in the kind of crisis they're in, which, by the way, was created by the same policies that these technocrats are telling us to follow. You know, it was the kind of austerity budgets, the kind of focus on financial markets and letting financial markets dominate everything that created the crises in Europe. And our governments here are trying to take us down the same path. So I think that there is alternatives to this, and we used to have a much more democratic process leading into the budget than we have now.
Hold off on the alternatives because we're going to get to that later in our chat.
Okay, sure.
But let me come back to Don Drummond for a second. You know, it's ironic that yes, they did bring Don Drummond in, and you know, a lot of attention, a lot of foo-for-ah around the recommendations he made. But it seemed to me that the government actually prided itself on not following some of the more significant recommendations of Drummond's that would have saved billions of dollars. So in that respect, does it not seem to you like the elected officials really are still in charge?
Oh yeah, I'm not saying they're giving over power to technocrats or to Bay Street people. What I'm saying is they're valuing the advice of a certain sector of society much more than anyone else. And I have real questions about that. So what it does is it gives them a kind of out. You know, if they want to do something like, let's say, the Ontario government, if they had wanted to cut funding to education, which they've done, or to full-year kindergarten, they could have used it as an excuse if that's what they wanted to do, since they had promised to do otherwise. So it gives them an excuse to do otherwise. But sometimes it's got a positive. I think, in fact, the advice of Standard & Poor's, a rating agency in New York, had a positive impact on the budget in Ottawa. Even though I don't agree with the budget, it would have been probably much worse if they hadn't been hearing from the technocrats that deep cuts would stall the economy. So I'm not saying that these kinds of people don't have some valuable advice to give to governments. The problem is that they're set up as the best people to know about what's necessary for the economy. And I think that's part of the whole thinking, our whole thinking about economics now, which is focused on what's good for Bay Street, what's good for Wall Street, and not what's good for Main Street.
Okay, get comfortable for a bit, because I'm going to read a longish quote here from Maclean's magazine, then come back with a bit of a longish question as well. This is from John Geddes in Maclean's a few days ago. Despite economic evidence to the contrary, in my view, the GST cut worked. That's a quote from Stephen Harper's former Chief of Staff, Ian Brodie. It worked in the sense that it helped us to win. That's the end of the quote. It's not really surprising, of course, that campaign calculations lay behind the GST cuts, which have cost the federal government about $12 billion a year at the worst possible time. What's noteworthy, the author says, is that Brodie doesn't shrink from publicly asserting that such a major public policy decision can still be deemed a success, even in the face of evidence to the contrary, if that move paid the desired political dividends. Here's the case, Judy, for the technocrats. We have some big, complex decisions to make. Our elected officials, some would say, have not demonstrated that they can put ideology, partisanship, and self-interest aside when making these big decisions, and therefore, the argument goes, we need more politically neutral, technocratic experts to get the job done. You're shaking your head already.
Yeah.
Go ahead, tell me.
It's a very dangerous argument, a very dangerous argument. Sure, you know, politicians go for political expediency. And, you know, I've written 2 books about the need to reform the political system to have more pressure on politicians from citizens, engaged citizens, not from pollsters and spinmeisters and all that. And I'm very unhappy with the direction that the political system has taken. But if you start saying that we can use paid henchmen of politics to tell us what to do and not give it the test of any kind of democratic process, then we're really looking at authoritarian systems. So we could say, well, China, you know, China is doing very well with cutting down on pollution because it's an authoritarian state. And so when they say cut down on pollution, everybody cuts down on pollution. Nobody has any choice. They don't have to worry about getting reelected, so they can make the tough decision. So are we saying democracy has failed so totally that politicians can't make the tough decisions? Me, I'd rather say, let's reform democracy, make it, in fact, more responsible to citizens, not less responsible to citizens. And the problem is that there's too much power in a kind of cynical political operatives who all they care about is the polls, up and down in the polls, and not the lives of people. That's why we need more participatory democracy, in my view.
Understood. Just before I go on, I should correct myself. That quote from John Geddes and Maclean's was from a few years ago, not a few days ago. March 27th, but 2009, not 2012. It seems to me as well, though, that I mean, you could make the argument there are elites running the show. Whether it's a technocratic elite or a political elite, it's still an elite. And which would you rather have? You'd rather have the political elites? You think they're better and less discredited these days? Am I hearing you right?
No, I'm not saying they're less discredited. I don't see how anybody could be more discredited. But what I'm saying is that there is a pressure of citizens. There can be a pressure of citizens on the political elite, whereas the technocratic elite have no pressure. Look, for example, what happened on Wall Street after the 2008 crash. I mean, these people have no shame. They make money out of everything. And they don't care what people think of them. It doesn't matter what people think of them. They're just figuring out, you know, all kinds of ways to make a buck. And that's what, you know, there's good people. Don Drummond is a good person. I'm not saying that about him personally. I'm just saying this is how that system works. And do we want people like that who are only interested in making money for themselves, making decisions on our lives? I don't think so. Now, politicians are not doing the job they should do. Governments are not doing the job they should do. But I say let's make them more accountable to us, not less accountable to us. And that's the point that I'm making. Okay,
let's pick up on that. What's the Rebick doctrine then going forward, how they become more accountable to us? If it's not the technocrats, what's the alternative?
Well, I think, you know, given that we've just had a budget, one alternative to look at is participatory budgeting, which started in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, Brazil, in the late 1990s. And it's really proven itself at a municipal level at least to be a very exciting process. The corruption, which is a big problem in the global south, has been done away with mostly in places where citizens are involved in decision making. There's way more social justice in the decisions that get made. There's been way less deficit. I'll give an example. In Porto Alegre, the government didn't think they could afford childcare because in that case they were a socialist government and they thought they had to have state-run, unionized childcare. And people said, no, we need childcare, but we can run it at a community center. It'll be a lot cheaper. And the government agreed to it because they had agreed to this participatory budget process. So the people found a way to do what they needed at a cheaper price than the government thought they could do it. And anywhere that it's been tried, and it's been tried in about 3,000 municipalities around the world, it really produces better government and more efficient spending. Because people living in their communities, they know what they need, and they also know how, and they can be quite creative about how to provide it without it costing a fortune of money. And I think that's the direction that we should go in, to have more citizen engagement. You know, in the 80s and the 90s, which is when I was an active advocate, like in the women's movement, the budget process was the Minister of Finance would go and meet with different groups. He'd meet with business groups, of course, but he'd also meet with labor, with women's groups, with environmental groups.
Doesn't he do
and
that
there was
anymore?
a whole public process that went on.
They don't
No,
do
they
that
don't
anymore?
do that anymore.
No?
No, they meet with, behind closed doors, they meet with business, they meet with labor, but the finance minister doesn't travel and have open meetings where he meets with people who don't agree with him, people who do agree with him, people who are ideologically, no, they don't do that kind of thing, not the way that they used to.
Okay, let me ask you about this.
You know, we didn't always get what we wanted, but it was a democratic process.
You felt you were heard anyway. Let me ask if there's
Yes.
any jurisdiction that you know of in Canada, you know, federal, provincial, municipal, whatever, that has tried it the way you just described it.
Well, the only jurisdiction, yes, in Montreal, some of the smaller towns in Montreal have tried it to very good effect. And also, you know, because Montreal is made up of a series of small towns, they didn't merge like Toronto did. And Guelph, Ontario did it as well, and they're still doing it, although with much less money. But now we have a situation where New York City, boroughs in New York City are using a participatory budget process. And in fact, just yesterday started an international conference on participatory budgeting. So it's quite advanced. It's been studied by the World Bank. It's quite advanced. There's a lot of studies been done on the effectiveness of it. The problem is if it's only in a municipality and you still have the province or the state and the federal government working in the old ways, it tends to be a little symbolic. Right? So what I'm saying is let's look at the participatory budget as a model and bring it into the whole budgetary process. And this is a thing where the politicians don't make the decision, the citizens make the decision, you see? And that's the key, so that it doesn't become token, it becomes real. And that's a real change from the system that we're in now. But I think we have to go onto that road, because otherwise we're going to go on the other road, which is to a more authoritarian, and I think that's happening already, a more authoritarian form of government, which is much less providing what people need. And then you start to have more and more conflict, like we're seeing right now in Quebec.
Well, let me put that in our last 30 seconds here. Let me try this, because an argument we're hearing in Europe these days is that the technocrats are as prominent as they are because the problems are so great and the decisions that need to be made are so complex, and the speed with which these decisions need to be made is such that, I'm sorry, participatory democracy, they would argue, is a kind of a luxury we just don't have time for. What do you say to that?
I think they're completely wrong, and all you have to see is what's happening on the streets of Europe, where people are in total revolt. And that conflict is going to cost them a lot more than taking a few more months to make some good decisions based on what people need and not what you know, the banks need.
Gotcha. Judy, always a pleasure having you on TVO. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Judy Rebick, author of Occupy This.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.